How have different historical societies allocated educational resources is the question we are asked to answer. And the next one is, should education be directed only towards those who have the greatest chance of success? Do you see any examples of schooling practices that reflect this today? In my section of this presentation, I will be covering the Middle Ages or medieval time period, which ran between the 5th and the 15th century. If you look at it historically, it is divided into 3 different periods. The first one, early Middle Ages, the second, High Middle Ages, and the third, Middle Ages. During these Middle Ages, fighting against the Islamic Empire to take back the Eastern Mediterranean, especially Jerusalem for the Christian religion. These wars were called the Crusades. The Crusades equal a reappearance in Europe of the classics, Greek and Roman works of philosophy and literature, and this brought on the Renaissance. I think it's important to mention, in order for you to better understand the Middle Ages, mindset towards education is if you have a little background info on the hierarchical system they used. The medieval ages was defined by a feudal system, meaning lords, kings, knights, vassals. Vassals are lower class who worked for upper class and attended by servants. And last but not least, we have the peasants. When someone was born into a certain group, they rarely moved to another level. This was the feudal system. So the feudal system was the law of the land. The upper class maintained control over the lower class. Kings often thought it was a divine right. God made them king. Another little funny bit of information is that many fairy tales have their roots in Middle Ages. When you read about castles built for lords and knights and kings, the stories are being told about this time in history. The peasants believed that the harder they worked, the more money they gave to the church, and the more they served the church, the better the afterlife would be for them. So it's needless to say that the church played an important role in medieval education and had control over it. So educational system is pretty simple to understand. Ordinary people would not receive education unless they associated themselves with the church. So during the medieval times, we had a variety of different schools, but only a few received education. All the schools had to do with the church. You had small informal schools in the parish church. You had gilded schools, preparatory grammar schools, and song schools, the cathedral schools. What sorts of things are being taught in these schools? So the alphabet, religious rites, lessons such as the Ten Commandments. In grammar schools, you would also learn Latin grammar. So this was also the trading language at the time. Composition and translation. I think it's good to note as well that most schools had no books. Books were very expensive and had to be transcribed by scribes. So during the medieval times, many different schools operated with no books. Students were taught by skilled masters and often educated for dubious benefits. An example of this is the rich who provided education often did so for their personal gain. There were very few that really wanted to educate people in the true spirit of being enlightening more minds. The most educated people were those educated in the church. Many who worked in the monasteries had also taken a vow of isolation. This made me giggle because it demonstrates the extent of the church's control over what would be taught. So, in the church mindset, let's educate them but not let them speak about it. It was common that wealthy local merchants would set up grammar schools. This was needed because of the developing merchant trade that was taking place at the time. The trading language was Latin grammar, so All lessons taught in grammar school was taught in Latin, and these were learned by heart. Books were very costly, so no one could afford them. A look at medieval times education and the 21st century. So I did a little comparison of in medieval time, only boys could study, and this was controlled by the church. Now in the 21st century, girls and boys can study. During medieval times, they didn't have books, and everything was learnt by heart. Now we have lots of books, as well as the World Wide Web. In medieval times, some children couldn't study. Now, all children must study and learn. It's still not equal for all, but they can all learn. Medieval times, when they made mistakes, they were punished. Now, teachers don't do that. Medieval times, all schools were very small. Now, there are schools bigger than that. In medieval times, university students chose their own course of studies, hired their own professors, picked their own hours of study. They were free to leave one professor if they tired of him and join another. They could attend several lectures before deciding whether to pay him or not. Now we pay lots of money and have to commit to courses, set time frames, and we have to commit to a field of study. So by the early 1300s, we have lots of wars and diseases. 1315 to 1317, there's a famine. We have the 100-Year War. The wars were made much worse by the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. It spread along the Silk Road from China to Europe, starting in 1328, killing millions of people and causing the collapse of the Mongol Empire. By the 1400s, after the plague, Europe looked very different, and the wars were over and Middle Ages were coming to an end. Here begins the Renaissance from the 14th to the 17th century. It is thought as the bridge between Middle Ages and modern history. The word Renaissance is French for and meaning rebirth. The Renaissance started as a cultural movement in Italy in the late medieval period that later spread to the west of Europe. When I think of Renaissance, I automatically think of art, and artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, as well as some literature created during that time, works by Shakespeare, for example. It was a time of creativity, imagination, and curiosity. It was also the age of exploration, such as explorers such as Columbus and Marco Polo. But I'm jumping ahead. The main shift in education started with the invention of the Gutenberg printing press in 1450. This invention revolutionized education. We now have a faster way of spreading information. We can compare it to today's World Wide Web. This press allowed communication through all of Europe. Before the printing press, writings and drawings had to be completed by hand. This was reserved work for scribes who lived and worked in monasteries. The books were usually only owned by monasteries or educational institutions or extremely rich people. Most books were religious in nature. If a family might be lucky enough to own a book, and this would have been the Bible. Johann Gutenberg's invention changed all this. The press allowed communication through all of Europe. A new trade was also born with academic benefits, spreading information to vast audience. The side effect, people could read and increase their knowledge. This opened the doors to new ideas and discussions. Latin language declined as other languages became norms in locally printed materials. So the press improved global knowledge and changed education. This invention benefited the Roman Empire as the first book published was the Bible in Latin. The Bible was now available to non-clergymen, spreading influence across Europe. Martin Luther's 95 Theses called out the Holy Roman Empire for its corruption, and lies this also gained traction into the printing press. Renaissance humanist writers were preoccupied with education for morality and virtue. Daughters of the elite received education similar to sons, and a few went to become renowned painters and scholarly. The Catholic Church quickly realized that the printing press would undoubtedly take away its upper hand, its control over its people. It was thought to be dangerous because now they could think and have new ideas. Lord forbid. So censorship was introduced into the printing shop in 1487. Church authorities had to approve all books before publication. They had done this in the past, but now they could not keep up with the printing press. One of the forbidden prints was the Bible, printed in any other language than Latin. Protestant Reformation movements began in 1517 with Martin Luther, due to his insistence that all Christians be able to read the Bible in their own language. The printing press helped spread the word. In France, during the reign of Louis XIII, we saw the creation of the Royal Printing Press, and in 1620, l'Académie Française also was established. There was numerous amounts of censorship going on in France at this time. None of the works could be published without going through the church, and you could not print anything. In closing, I'd like to say that the printing press equaled the playing field for success for students and pupils, giving them access to books and new ideas, and education was easier due to the printing press. And now we're going to move on to the next presenter.